Hi, welcome back to EB Insights. I'm your host, Sandra Dreyer, and today's episode is for anyone who manages a global employer brand, particularly if you are attracting talent in the Middle East, the UAE, the Gulf region. This is the episode for you. Because today I talked to Hassan Al Hindwan, who is a talent and employer brand leader in the UAE. And we talk about the different ways in which you attract talent in this region through platforms like social media, the messages that they're specifically looking to hear, and also the role the government plays in talent attraction, which is particularly interesting. So, again, if you have any global employer brand responsibilities, this is definitely a topic that's going to be interesting to you. So, I really hope you enjoy the episode. Hi there. Welcome back to Clickify's EB podcast, the podcast for anyone managing employer brand, employee engagement, or the talent experience. We are so excited today because I have a really interesting topic that I think will be fascinating for anyone who manages a global brand. My guest today is Hassan Al Hindwan. He's an employer branding leader based out of Dubai, who most recently managed the global talent brand for Sanofi, and he has extensive experience in talent management and the employee experience. As I mentioned, today's a great episode for anyone managing a global brand, but particularly anyone who is managing a brand that has a presence in the Middle East, because there are cultural nuances of the workforce that are really important to keep in mind and that are very different and need to be addressed in any employer brand strategy. So we're going to dig into those nuances a little bit today. And I am really excited, Hassan, for your willingness to come on the podcast and talk to us about that. So welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Sandra. I'm actually also very equally excited. Thank you for the opportunity to be here with you, and let's dig into all of these super exciting topics.
Fantastic. So before we get started, I just want to get a little bit of background on you and how you navigated into a career on employer branding.
Actually, that's a very interesting question because I actually bumped into the world of employer branding during my first position when I was a management trainee at Henkel. So at that time, Henkel as a brand was not very well known, but Henkel's products were extremely well known. I'm sure people would know Persil or Schwarzkopf in the world of hairdressers and beauty, but as a parent brand, there was lack of awareness in the market. So in the Middle East, we had to figure out a way on how to get early talent in specific more excited about this great company and a great brand. And that is where I got into communications and engagement and really bringing the brand outside through media, through social, through events. And I was like, this is super interesting. I would love to do more of this. And then as I got through other parts of my career with other brands like Nestle and CHEP, there was no dedicated employer branding function in the Middle East at that time. But I raised my hand and started taking over any people and culture communication initiatives or topics on top of my role as a talent management leader or an HR business partner. And that is how I got to manage their top employer certification and communicating that to the market on social and digital and different other areas. And then I was very fortunate to land a gig in Sanofi. And that is where I actually had a full-time role end to end doing employer branding every single day.
That's amazing. So I think, it's interesting. I think probably, we think about employer brand and there's a different level of maturity in different markets. I've often talked about the beginning of my career in employer branding. I think my title was called something like brand communications and public relations for talent acquisition. I mean, it was something very, it was a very long title. So, but again, this is just, different level of maturity. I think in Europe, particularly in the UK, it is a much more mature career than it is in some of the other territories. So I guess in particularly in your market, being one of the first, employer branding leaders in that territory in the Middle East, what are some of the major significant changes that you've seen evolve in this space?
There's been a lot in a very short time. And I think what moves it is actually the audience that we are managing or that we need to attract or we need to retain. So in the GCC in specific, which we call the Arabian Gulf, there is a very young audience. Two-thirds are under the age of 35. They are very social media and brand savvy, which means that to be able to not only stand out, to just be able to attract talent, your employer brand becomes the most significant factor that will make the difference between who are you and why should I join you to I actually want to click the apply button on the career site. It is critical in this market because of the dynamics that we face. And on top of, again, a very competitive labor market because it's very expat focused as well. We have people coming in from all over the world. If I can give you just one very real example, post a position in Dubai on LinkedIn, and you will get thousands of applicants in 2 days. Where in other parts of the world, that might take a longer time to be able to get that number of applicants. It's just the region is very attractive for people from all over the globe. So we face different dynamics, which means it needs to be tackled with various solutions and tactics, and employer branding is definitely one of those tactics.
So when you're seeing those, so to go back to that example, those thousands of applications in LinkedIn, what would you say is the mix from that expat community versus people who are residents or live there from that territory?
It's a very interesting nuance, actually, Sandra, because, for example, we have people that don't live here, but what I found out is, people in talent acquisition that I work with will tell me they would put themselves as actually being based in Dubai or being based in Saudi, but they're actually not. So you would have to dig deeper and understand where this person really is, because they're worried if they do not put that on their LinkedIn profile, it might reduce their chances of getting a role here. However, in terms of percentage, I would say for residents who are still expats, it would be like 50 to 40% of applicants, and then another 30% from people who are not living in this part of the world, and then another 10% from nationals of the country.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I think about even just families or two working parents, because I know with my husband's career, we've been asked to move to many different countries. And there's always the consideration we would have all of that managed by his employer, but what would my job be and how does that process work for a spouse? And so to your point, when people say, well, I'm based in Dubai, are these people who are planning to move to Dubai if they get a job, or is this, or they just want to use that as something that kind of boosts maybe the attractiveness of their application? Because when you're looking at it from a talent attraction perspective, then you're really talent attraction geographically is not limited to the confines of MENA or Middle East, North Africa. It's really all over the place, right? Because you do have such a heavy population of expats in that territory.
100%. So I think it's the former. Like usually, of course, we do not know really the intentions behind every applicant applying. But what I have at least seen or heard is that people have intentions to move, and therefore to bolster the attractiveness of the application, they would put Dubai as a location, for example.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about the Gulf region because you and I did did get a chance to talk about this, and you gave me some really aha moments that I hadn't considered. And I've managed employer brand globally before as well. I know many people who are listening to this manage globally, and I think that particularly for this region, there are some very important distinguishing factors that differentiate that population from Western countries specifically. So a couple of stats. You had mentioned this before. 70% of the population is actually under 30. That that blows my mind. Definitely not being in that population and haven't been in a while. 70%, this is another huge statistic, which is interesting, and I'm really excited to dig into this with you. 70% of working Saudis are employed by the government. So that means only 30% of working Saudis than our private sector. So that's very interesting. And then another thing that I had looked into kind of preparing for this. So Saudi Vision 2030 aims to remake its economy in order to reduce Saudi Arabia's dependence on oil, diversify its economy, and develop public service sectors. So really increasing that non-oil industry trade. And now within that population, from a talent attraction perspective, those private companies that are all really heavily competing for that 30% or that very small percentage that's not employed by the government is putting a much greater emphasis on total rewards and benefits, not on pay, because that's becoming much more attractive. So I kind of want to dig into that a little bit. If you're looking at a population where the majority of this population is under 30, and then the majority of this population is working for the government, you had mentioned before some of the requirements and some of the things that private sector has to abide by and be cognizant of when looking at sort of that talent attraction strategy. So can you dig into how those factors play into employer brand development and for the private sector specifically?
No, absolutely. So basically, across the GCC, which is basically the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Oman, Kuwait, and Bahrain, there is a reality which is the government wants to increase employment of their people in the private sector, which means there have been policies around nationalization that have been launched. Maturity of these policies differ from country to country. It also depends on the number of nationals that exist in the population. So, for example, Saudi Arabia has a large population of nationals that exist, and while in the UAE and Qatar, you've got lesser population of nationals. But regardless of the number of nationals, there is a huge focus from the government, starting from the vision, which you mentioned, Sandra. The vision is to produce diversified economies, which means you need people that will be working in different sectors. And this is a partnership between the government and the private sector. Now, what does this mean for employer branding in specific? You have two workforces that you need to attract. You've got a workforce that is expat, that comes from different parts of the world or are currently resident in this region. So when we talk about the expat population, on average, there is usually an excess of supply versus demand. There is exceptions if you're looking for specialized skill set, but if we talk, the generalistic roles that you would have in an organization like HR and marketing, etc., you have an excess supply. While on the nationalization part, you have a huge demand, but less supply of talent. And the policies have been created by the government to actually encourage private sector companies and corporations to invest in not only attracting, but also developing the talent that you're after. And going back to your point of total rewards, a company can only pay so much. There's restrictions on budgets. But what you can do is, because this is a very young population that is really hungry to learn, really hungry to develop and acquire skills and learn, the total rewards becomes a very critical element. And on top of that, companies that take cultural nuances into perspective actually win.
Hmm.
So if you take into account, one simple example is the national population is very patriotic because the governments of the GCC really take care of their people. There is a fantastic welfare system in place. So in return, the populations are very patriotic, which means if as a company you tie in your vision and your ambition with the vision of the country and you showcase that through your employer brand, you will get national talent that are interested to apply. But if you do not showcase the cultural nuance of development, of learning, of really thinking about what is attractive to this population, then you will struggle to attract national talent. And for example, in Saudi, if I take an example, nationalization equals to your company's ability to continue operating. It impacts business sustainability. So your ability to attract and keep nationals is important to continue um, operating in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The UAE is now also increasing its focus on Emiratization with huge incentives from the government. But again, it goes back to the situation of, are you really taking into account cultural nuances, the audience that you're trying to attract? They're young, they're energetic, but they want to know that the employer cares about the country that they're in. They want to know that the employer really understands who they are and what they need. So if you put your employer branding umbrella on it and you really focus on these nuances, you're able to win in this market.
So very, very fascinating. So a few questions. First of all, and this may not be an issue, but is there a requirement that the government will put on private industry or private sector on the percentage of nationals that need to be employed before they take expats? I have to, is there sort of a, X amount, or there has to be some proof that there has been a process where the nationals are prioritized over expats, for example?
So like I said, there's a difference of maturity in terms of nationalization policies. But going back to your point, yes, there is a percentage that you need to accrue to be able to align to the policies of the government. So in Saudi, for example, it depends by industry. Different industries have different percentages as a quota. In the UAE, there is percentages as well that you need to align to depending on the number of people that you've got in your organization. So it's divided by small, medium, large, etc.
Okay, so for private industry, so for people managing employer brand that are trying to promote these opportunities, one factor to keep in mind is the percentage of nationals that need to be employed. So now you look at that percentage of nationals, and you have mentioned quite a bit here, which is this sense of national pride. And also, given, as you mentioned, that the welfare state is very rich there, that the government really takes care of their citizens or residents, which, given 70% of those working population are employed by the government, is a huge indicator of that. So you have this sense of national pride, and there are also factors that if you want to attract someone out of those government type of positions and roles, because as you mentioned, there's one thing to say 70%, 30%. There's another when you're looking at particular skill requirements,
Yeah.
that that population gets a lot smaller. So if you're trying to attract people out of that, you mentioned you have to really understand and reflect the culture and what's important, and the national pride, which I think is very different from Western countries. Because if I think about sort of the employer brand strategies in Western countries, it isn't around national pride as much as it is personal interest, right? And personal gain. So there's that element, which is also very different, it sounds like, in these countries and these territories. How do you thread that needle, right? Because it is really challenging when you've got all of these sort of factors that you have to consider when you're looking at this talent. So how did you effectively thread that needle in your role?
So basically, there was a couple of things. You cannot be everything to everyone. You will have to understand what you as an organization are strong in. So what we did is first we did a deep insight into the talent market that we need to tackle and understand what matters to them. And we understood that what matters to them is engagement. What matters to them is a caring culture. What matters to them is work to life balance. And what matters to them is learning opportunities. The national pride it's a basic fundamental on which you build these pillars. The pillars are universal. Engagement is universal. A caring culture is universal. Work-life balance and well-being is universal. Learning opportunities is universal. But how do you tie it in to the cultural nuance? So, for example, community is a big deal amongst the nationals of the region. Having a community is important. So how do we ensure, and we had a community culture in the organization that I was supporting. So we brought that in and tied it into the employer brand, that when you come, you're not alone, you've got a community. You've got a community of people to help you. You've got a community of people to grow. You've got a community of people to learn with. When it came to engagement, again, I was fortunate enough to work in an organization where engagement was not just a tick in the box. Every leader had engagement tied in into their KPIs. So how did we bring out the stories of how the organization is focusing on engagement, creating an engaged culture? We also tied in moments that mattered to the population. National Day is a huge moment for this population because it's a pride of transformation as a country. These countries have really transformed in a very little time. So that we ensure that we position National Day and the stories of how people have transformed their careers, how people have developed in that moment in time. Ramadan is another thing, and Eid is another thing that's very important for people in this part of the world. So, how do we take moments that matter and integrate employer branding into it? But the story needs to continue because there is a lot of universal things that is also very important to this population. They are Gen Zs and millennials where social media is critical. How you position yourself as a brand is important. A constant and engaging content calendar with relevant topics is super critical. But then at the same time, what interests me is because of this community-led culture, you have to think of high tech, but high human moments. Yes, they're very brand savvy. There is a huge consumption of social media. I was reading a stat that said the UAE and Saudi Arabia is on the top in terms of social media consumption per person. So yes, there is that hunger to learn more on social, but at the same time, they need that human touch and that human element. So what we found out is once you've attracted and raised awareness on social and digital, then build human initiatives to connect with the people that are interested with you.
Yeah.
Build those forums, build those, let's say tours in your office. Create majlis. A majlis is a place where people in the Gulf go to after coming back from work and interacting with other people in their community. So create a work majlis, for example. Understand what the issues are and answer the issues that people have. And once you build that, the loyalty is very strong. And if you take that exercise outside and showcase it on social and other platforms digitally, you will win in this market because the reality is not a lot of organizations do it from a social media perspective.
Yeah.
That's where the potential lies.
No, that's great. And I think so what I'm really hearing is understand what's important to that audience, understand the importance of the evolution of those countries from a workforce perspective. There has been significant transformation, and I
Yes.
think more recent significant transformation than you would have seen in Western countries. Being able to tie into that narrative and be able to showcase and promote employees in that light is really important, and have a very close pulse on what your community, what your employees are thinking and feeling, and
Sure.
ensure that you are tapping into those moments that matter for them
Yes.
culturally, religiously, etc., to be able to highlight your employer brand through that lens, because that is
Yes.
something that is extremely close to this community.
Exactly. And to add on that, it's actually global companies have an edge because the population is hungry to work with a global audience, diverse talents. So that edge already exists. It's how do you use those opportunities and then link in the cultural nuance because you're already winning by allowing the audience to connect with a huge potential world of talent, which is what they're eager to do. They want to explore. They want to understand what happens in other parts of the world. So you would you would already win. You just tie in the cultural nuances.
And I think that's an important thing to highlight, to reinstate here, because
Mm.
again, when I look at, and you manage a global brand, so you're managing it with Western countries, you're managing it within MENA, the Gulf. I think that that piece that you just mentioned is another differentiator, which is really wanting to connect with the global community, connect with global stories and global opportunities. Personally, I'm somebody who has traveled a lot, and my husband and I've been to over 85 countries, and we've been to all 7 continents twice. That's something that's really important to me. For a lot of Western, especially in the US, that sort of, yes, there is that global awareness and global understanding, but probably not as strong as what I'm hearing you speak about in the Gulf, about connecting with that global territory and connecting with that global community and wanting more and more exposure to that. And then as you're personalizing and individualizing that message, ensuring you're tapping into what's important to that individual. So I think I want to make sure we're highlighting that. You also touched on social media, and I want to reiterate what you said, which is there within this territory, the highest social media consumption on many of the social media apps that we use, that is where the highest consumption is. So, a couple of stats. WhatsApp is the most popular social network among internet users age 16 to 64 in this territory. There are now more than 75 million unique Snapchat users in the Middle East in 2023, and it's growing by 33% every year. 33% is a huge amount. It's growing every year. And 5 of the top 20 markets for Snapchat by total size are in MENA, and 3 of those are in the top 10. Obviously, we have a young population. We've talked about 70% of the population is under 30. They're living on their phone, they're living on their devices. So that makes sense that social media is so prevalent in their day to day lives. But you had mentioned something when we spoke before about how the government is actually communicating to its residents and citizens through social media. So
Yeah.
can you, because I think it's really important for anyone who's trying to, tap into the application or activation of your EVP, when you're trying to activate it through social media, really understanding how much of a heavy reliance, but how mature this audience is when it comes to social media. Because some of the tactics and some of the things that you might use in other territories, where I think pretty much everywhere we all have a over reliance on our devices and our phones, but I think this market particularly is living day to day through communications on these devices that have nothing to do with companies trying to sell them something or influencers or chatting with one another, but literally their government is communicating to them about local issues and so can you talk a little bit about that, because I think that's an important point to highlight for this audience as well.
No, absolutely. I'm smiling because initially I thought that is the norm, Sandra. But it's only when I started managing a global brand did I understand that the nuances are very different in different regions of the world. What works in China doesn't work in Europe. What works in the US wouldn't work in China. What works in the Gulf wouldn't necessarily work in France. However, what was interesting is yes, for example, when COVID hit, the updates that were sent through social media. We knew about all of the policies that had to be followed. We knew about progress. We knew about everything through social. Whenever the government wants to talk about a new initiative, a new service that is being launched, it's shared on social media, whether it's about residents and resident affairs, or it's about citizen affairs, or it's about the country affairs overall. So social media is the way people get to know about information. Even if the government does Instagram lives to educate its audience on a specific initiative or element that they are launching, so far and so forth. So it's not just a nice to have, it's the mode of communication in this part of the world. It's how people communicate. Even if you are unhappy about a service, you talk on social and it gets resolved. So now taking into account that this is the behavioral pattern of our audience, it's what people expect as well in the workforce. They expect you to share about your culture. They expect you to share about your roles. They expect you to share stories. They expect you to share about your brand. That is the expectation. However, the market from an employer branding and a people and culture perspective, there is elements of it that has caught up, but it's not mature like product branding or government communications at the moment on social media. That is where I see a huge opportunity. It's an open door for companies that will communicate their story and their vision and showcase their people and the culture consistently, though, because I've seen companies that start and then there's
it becomes
lack
too
of
much
momentum,
work and they lose
and
momentum.
it's like the channel is stuck. There's a lot of opportunity, and there's different ways. There's different ways that you could do live sessions, you could share stories, you could do paid ads. It really works, but it's about also understanding the audience, like we said. For example, again, what fascinated me in my global role is the channels we were using. We had to differentiate by audience, either by generation or by the talent pool or by country as well. Yes, Instagram is a channel that was used across the organization, but then how you use Instagram is different in the Gulf than it would be, for example, in France. Yeah. So this is another thing that I would love to share, because sometimes, especially in global organizations, I have found out that it is mandated at times what channels you can use for different reasons. But if you have a huge business, I would say, in this part of the world, then you would need to flex the platforms that you use to reach your audience. For example, Snapchat is huge, like you mentioned, Sandra. TikTok is huge, as is Instagram.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you is what the biggest platforms are that companies are using. So TikTok, Snapchat, and Instagram. Is there one that is heavier used than the others, especially from an employment perspective?
I think because, like I shared, there's really not a lot of employer branding happening on social. The- I can't say it doesn't happen. It does happen, but does it happen as much as in the UK? The answer is no.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's where the opportunity lies. But when we talk
Huge
about
opportunity.
government communications, product branding, influencer content, now TikTok is picking up extremely well in the region. But Instagram is, I call it like the loyal app for people. Snapchat as well, but then it depends on pockets of the region. Because if we go back to one point, which is we talked about expats and nationals, and I just want to clarify one thing, because usually when we say expats, people think that it's only people that come in and live for 2 to 3 years and then move out. In this part of the world, I'm an expat. I've lived here for 34 years.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But I'm an expat. I'm a resident.
Interesting. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So expats are still the majority in a lot of jobs in the private sector. Yeah. So we also then need to come to country. In Saudi Arabia, Snapchat is huge. While in other countries, for example, TikTok may now start to overtake. I'm assuming the trend is TikTok will start to overtake Snapchat. But if we then go down and drill down into the details, there's a difference between how many people have an account and how many people actually engage. So I'm sure if we go to the stats, we might find that Snapchat or Facebook have very high app downloads, but then if we go to the engagement, it's a different
Yeah.
story. So long story short, it's about what are the audience that you're after. If it, for example, if it's young people or if it's more senior leaders, you would need to differentiate the platform and the content.
Yeah. And just to wrap on the social media piece, I think everybody will say that there is a heavy reliance on social media almost universally now, right, in
Yeah.
developed countries. And so, you could say, yes, well, we've all, we're aware people are attached to their devices. I think, when you use the example of COVID and how people found out what the requirements were, I would say that a lot of us would do Google searches, right? So we're proactively looking for things versus the government kind of communicating to me through Instagram. That's not something that I necessarily would have waited for I live in Miami, so I wouldn't have waited for Miami-Dade County to, do an Instagram live. I would just Google what are the rules in Miami-Dade County gyms because I'm about to go to one. So I think those are the things that, again, because this audience is so mature and they are so used to getting inundated with messaging through social media, understanding that you need to up the game a bit with that is important. And I think, too, just moving to kind of the last topic I wanted to cover, because you have a lot of experience in employee engagement. Getting your own employees engaged in social media so that they're sharing with their networks has to be critically important. One of just a quick stat from the Gallup State of Global Workplace in 2023, it said the Middle East scored the second lowest percentage of engaged employees, with only 15% actively engaged at work, which would make me nervous if I was if I was running private industry sector in the Middle East. And the number of quiet quitters is also very high at 62%. So you've got a very low engaged workforce and you have a very high attrition, essentially, the quiet quitters. So given the intrinsic link between how engaged employees are and how you attract future talent, what do you do in this area when you have those significant numbers at either end of the spectrum that is saying that there are not effective strategies right now in place? So from a cultural perspective, are there nuances that there's a reason? Because, immediately at this, I'm thinking, are these companies that are managing a global brand or managing a global HR or talent engagement or talent management function that just aren't considering these cultural nuances that we've discussed before? Or is there something else? What do you think is behind that?
I think there's different factors as well. There's multiple dynamics to take into consideration. When people talk about the Middle East, they usually consider the broader Middle East, but there's different geopolitical, economic, cultural dynamics that comes into play. The Greater Gulf region has different economic dynamics than the rest of the Middle East does, which means the engagement challenges or opportunities that exist in this territory would be very different from other parts of the Middle East. However, if we come into different elements, there's context that we also need to unpack a bit here, because the type of companies also has an impact. A global company, I've worked with a couple of them, use same engagement practices and policies that exist in different parts of the world. But what happens in, let's say, small to medium organizations that are not global brands? They might not have, again, I'm making an assumption here based on the stats, might not have enough focus on engagement because maybe their focus on HR is still on the admin side, on getting people in and getting people through hire to retire, whereas global brands would have resources or would have tactics and tools that enable them to engage their practices. But do we have a problem overall? Yes, because one, expats that come in, usually sometimes, and again, this is one of the reasons, they come in because they want to take the first job to step into this part of the world. And it might not be the job that they really want, but they want a foot in.
They want a
So
foot
they
in the
take
door.
it up. And then when they get another opportunity, they would jump to the opportunity that they want. Yeah? And this starts to create high turnover and sometimes lack of engagement. There's multiple factors. This is I take this topic to heart because I think it either makes or breaks organizations, honestly. But leadership styles, yeah, it also impacts because there's cultural nuances of company leadership and how do they engage their people. That's another factor. And because there is global, there's small to medium, there is local, there's many different types of organizations, you do not have a blanket approach to engagement. Some take it seriously, some don't. Yeah? Now, when it comes to employer branding and getting people to share, I love what you mentioned, Sandra, because if your employees are not engaged, they are not going to share the stories that you want them to share. So if you do not have an engaged culture, then I would say put advocacy and sharing of stories to the side first and focus on fixing your critical engagement issue. Now, I can only speak from the experience that I have had where engagement literally, I thought we even did a better job than the global counterpart that I was of, where number one, after the survey was launched, because the human touch was very important, leaders started doing roadshows to understand even more deeper the challenges or the opportunities that came out of the survey. And once that was done, there was a co-creation of updated initiatives and policies that reflected what people were concerned about. So people could really see action that happened after they put in their comments. So when the second survey came, it was like, okay, they are things that have actually shifted. If I can give one real example, people were frustrated about lack of transparency on compensation and benefits and rewards. Mm-hmm. So now that shifted and they started to be different initiatives that were taken to bring more transparency. People thought that there was not enough collaboration events going on in the organization that allowed people to understand what's happening in other departments. There started to be initiatives that happened to fix that issue so they could see. It's like you tell me, I action.
Right.
The next time those surveys came around, a shift happened. So just to bring up a point, it made it easier to create an advocacy program in that organization because people are passionate. People know that they have a voice. So they started sharing their authentic stories. It made it one level easier, I would say. Not very easy, but one level easier.
It's interesting too, because you bring up a really good point, which I hadn't really considered, which is people will take a role to get a foothold in there, right? Yeah. So if you're if I use the example I was using before and say one spouse has been transferred and the other spouse, if they get an opportunity at a job, they'll probably take it. Yeah. That doesn't necessarily mean there will be low employee engagement. You can easily be an engaged employee who isn't in a lifetime job, which most people are not in a lifetime job, right? Unless you start your own company and you never, sell it or leave it. Most people will be switching roles because they'll advance their careers, et cetera. That doesn't necessarily mean automatic low engagement. But I think what you said, and we've referenced a couple of times in this podcast, is really understanding and addressing those cultural nuances that exist with employees. Because if you had leaders, to your example, going and doing the roadshow or virtual roadshows or what have you, that dig into what that survey result is telling them to really understand the color commentary behind it, and then taking an action, that is naturally going to lead to some kind of an affinity that employee will have with that business. It doesn't mean they'll stay there forever. It doesn't mean they won't find another opportunity. But while they're there, the affinity for that organization and then their passion and their engagement and naturally their productivity would be higher as a result. So I do think, we go back to, the reason why we're doing this podcast is because there are so many interesting cultural nuances if you're doing work in the Middle East and the Gulf, that, if you oversee a global brand, it's very important as you're localizing that brand to take those cultural nuances into place. And I think that just further speaks to another area, which is employee engagement, which employee engagement is naturally linked with talent attraction, that
100%.
those individuals should keep in mind.
Actually, just when I was thinking about what you just said, because I think you brought up a super, super critical and important point. Employers that will win in this market are those who really think about the employee experience, genuinely think about the employee experience from hire to retire, how people feel, what is the tools that they have, what is the support that they need. And if they infuse an employee experience element across the people and culture function, you will stand out in this market, because engagement and collaboration and development is key. People are young, they're hungry to develop, but they also want a culture and a community. So I think if employee experience is really taken care of, well, I think you would be the employer of choice in this market.
So, kind of summarizing all of this, what are the key takeaways that I hope that people who listen to this walk away with? Understanding who this talent market is. It's a young audience. It is an audience that is heavily employed by the government. So the ability as a private sector to attract the right talent becomes that much more challenging. The heavy reliance on social media and the sophistication of social media consumption is very high in this market, and comparably, when you look across all the platforms, probably the heaviest usage in this market. So that's important to know. And then the cultural nuances and the importance of really focusing on the employee experience and understanding what motivates and drives this talent market specifically and catering to that, as well as allowing this talent to really engage and understand the global workforce, right? So even connecting that talent within the Gulf and creating those sort of experiences and an understanding of the workforce outside of that territory is extremely important to them. So I think those to me are the key takeaways. What am I missing? What else would you want people to walk away with?
Yeah, I think you've put it really beautifully, Sandra. I just think one thing that I would like to demystify, because I'm sure people will be like, but you've just talked about one part of the population, which is nationals, or attraction of nationals. And I think the reason we focused on attraction of nationals is because the nationalization policies have actually really progressed in the past couple of years. And it has direct impact on your ability to continue operating in this region. Yes, expats are a critical area of the workforce. They are 80 to 80, anything from 70 to 85% of the workforce. But for this population, because I understand that we've not spoken about them, in brief, it is universal. The factors that you would consider universally, you would consider for this population. But again, they live in this region. They are a part of this region. So the cultural nuances is where DEI becomes now a critical component, because you've got 85 or 65 nationalities working in one company, regardless of whether it's small, big, large, global, not global. There is a diversity of people working. So DEI becomes a critical component. But it's not that we're saying that expats, for example, you do not need to use employer branding. 100% you would need to use employer branding, because you are facing a different equilibrium. There is excess of supply versus demand. So this is where your employer brand becomes critical to get the right people who fit your culture code in. And for those that do not fit the culture code, your messaging, your content will basically share that narrative. So I just wanted to demystify that part, because some people might be like, oh, but I don't face those I don't face these challenges. I do not face what they're speaking about in the podcast. I just wanted to decimate the two.
And I think too, for that, important expat community, it is also that one piece that we didn't mention, which is reinforcing that sense of community. We talked about it
Yeah,
earlier, right? So there
yeah,
is still that requirement to enforce that sense of community with
yeah,
expats and nationals alike
yeah,
within
yeah,
this region, because that is such an important part of what is going to attract them to a potential employer. So I do think that that is yet another way that you can leverage, to your point, that DE&I strategy that you put across all of your employer branding. That's the sort of element of it that would be really important to
yeah.
sustain, whether you're talking about expats or nationals in this
Oh,
region.
national, 100%.
Great. Well, thank you so much. This has been enlightening. I think for a lot of employer brand leaders, particularly those that are working across multiple countries, multiple territories, sometimes we lean on the local recruiters. Sometimes we just send these sort of large, depending on the size resources that you have. Sometimes you put these large sort of brand packages and things together and say, here, go localize this and
Exactly.
good luck and hope it works. Because we don't have, maybe the ability to do as much customization. But I do think that there are so many things that we can pull away from what we've talked about today that should help them enhance and strengthen their ability to attract that talent in this region specifically. So thank you so much for your insights. This has been very, very educational, and I know will help a lot of people.
Thank you very much, Sandra. It was a pleasure to be on this episode. And I also genuinely, wholeheartedly hope it helps a lot of people who are thinking of either expanding or engaging the populations in this part of the world. Thank you very
Great.
much and
Thank
have a
you.
great evening.
Thank you, you too. Thank you again for joining us on today's episode. I hope anyone who does have employer brand responsibilities in the Middle East, in that region, got a lot of insights like I did from Hassan, and I want to thank him for joining me today. Please continue to join us as we launch our new episodes in the next few weeks. We are always looking for interesting topics and interesting guests. So if you would like to be one of our guests, please notify us and let us know. And thank you again for listening to us, and we'll see you next time.